Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Creative Noahland podcast. On this episode, I'm joined by Mark Wilkinson. Now Mark has truly led the artist's life. Known now for his screen printing and paste-up work that can be seen all around the world, Mark has devoted his life to the pursuit of creating. From an early age, it was drummed into Mark that you can literally take anything and turn it into something. Whether that's a simple line on a blank page or the deeply personal feelings of a breakup, it can all be turned into something of value. In this episode, we go into Mark's creative journey. From his early days living in abject poverty in his studio, making art and music, but very happy, to his band almost being signed by EMI, having all of his art dreams nearly come true, moving to Serbia to run artist colonies, falling in love, falling out of love, moving back to England and getting a quote-unquote normal job, the whole time consistently creating and trying to get better as an artist. Mark goes into detail about his process and how one creative mistake has led to his longest ongoing art project. Mark also shares the deeply personal story about how art and finding paste-ups in some way has helped him recover from major illness. Being outside, walking in the fresh air, being surrounded by like-minded people, sharing his work with the world and feeling even subconsciously like he still exists and has a purpose has all contributed to his recovery. Mark's journey is super interesting and full of twists and turns. Be sure to check out the links to his work and social media while you listen to the podcast, of course. You never know, you may already recognise his work, whether subconsciously or consciously, because it is pasted up across many of the major cities around the world. Anyway, he can tell you much more about that, so let's get into it. Sorting my notes is probably the wrong thing to do. Where do you think we should start?
Maybe the beginning is always a good... I don't know.
But I also feel like we kind of need to work from where we are now, backwards in a way.
Okay.
So, could you talk to me a little bit about your style of work now?
Well, I would say my style is generally figurative, faces, characters. You know, I never draw scenery or put my characters in a setting. And I would say that it's a combination of sort of comic book style with maybe some post-expressionist, a bit of Picasso, a bit of Basquiat, a bit of Keith Haring, a bit of everything that I've ever liked, sort of mixed up.
An amalgamation of sorts, which is what every creative turns into, I guess. We are an influence of all the ideas that we love.
Yeah.
And how does that manifest itself? Because what I'm getting to, Mark, is people can see your work on streets all over the world, whether they know it's your work or not. That's very cool.
Yeah. This year, my big passion has been getting into paste-up art. It's something I was interested in for a while, but I finally had the opportunity and the time to start doing it. And paste-up art's incredible. I mean, I've been a screen printer for like 7-8 years. But what tends to happen with a lot of screen printers is you make a lot of prints and they gather dust on a shelf at home. You're just churning them out like a printing machine. And I was like stockpiling stuff, intending to get into street art. And then over the last year and a half or so, I had cancer and I've been off work for a long time. So as I was gradually sort of healing and trying to build up my strength, I started to go out with a friend of mine, Boxy Trixie, who's an Argentinian paste-up artist. And I fell in love with it. Now, initially, I found it difficult to even put anything on a wall. I would get out of breath and be exhausted very easily or whatever.
Due to your illness?
Yeah. You know, like earlier this year, I would start pasting something on a wall and Boxy or somebody would have to finish it for me. But I just kept trying to do it whenever I felt I had the energy. And it's gave me something to sort of focus on. You know, it gave me something to be excited about. And
was that important at that point?
Yeah.
It sounds like a really obvious question.
Yeah.
But these paste ups and being outside in the fresh air and working alongside other like-minded people.
Well, on so many levels, it was important. I mean, just to get out in the fresh air, like you say, just to be walking around, just to be out in the world and to be sort of sharing yourself. I started to think about this quite a lot. Like most of the characters that I was stockpiling for years with the intention of sharing, you know, putting them on the streets. People are constantly telling me that these characters are self-portraits. And I really started to feel like that this was my way of, I think it's subconsciously like, oh, I'm still here. I'm alive. Like, I'm putting myself out in the world. I still exist. And there's something really nice about just putting your stuff out there. And then once you've done that, it's out of your hands. Somebody might come and tear it down tomorrow or paint over it or carefully peel it off the wall and take it home or whatever, put a poster over it. And there's something nice about that. You know, it's just like the main thing about art really, I think, is that you create things. And once you've created it, then you're on to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And there's something nice about not being so precious about what you've made. Share it with people and just let it go. Sometimes it might be there a year later or 6 months later. Sometimes it's gone the next day.
That's interesting. And I did want to talk about the characters and this idea that, do you feel like they're self-portraits now?
I don't draw them thinking I'm drawing myself. But I suppose without thinking about it, when you're drawing a face, the first one that you see every day yourself in the mirror, or, you know, like most of my characters don't have hair and I'm bald, you know, or some people, you know, like.
There is quite, I mean, obviously your friends have noticed it. I noticed it. But I just wondered whether we could delve in a little bit. You didn't know you were doing, that's a subconscious thing then.
I suppose
and
so.
Going back to putting those out in the world and feeling that you're still here and represented, and whether that's in your artwork. I mean, going through cancer must be terrifying, scary. I mean, I don't want to use words because I feel like I'm going to belittle it in every way, but what was art's role, not just the going out in the fresh air, but what do you think art's role has been in helping you recover?
Well, I think if you ask anybody, like, if somebody told you tomorrow that you had cancer, how would you react? And as you just said, you would expect people to be terrified and overcome with worry and concern and everything else. But I think until you're in a situation like that, you never know how you're going to respond to it. And I was very lucky in that I was just very positive throughout. I had moments early on where I thought, oh, okay, let's reflect a little bit here, you know, like what happens if I'm not here a year from now or whatever. But mostly I just felt like it's going to be fine and they just have to do what they have to do and I'll be okay. Like, I just believed that. And so, yeah, I feel very lucky that I managed to have like an optimistic response to it.
And in finding paste ups and these quote unquote self-portraits being pasted up, you mentioned about how it felt like it gave you something to feel like you were still here and still there. And also, did it feel like leaving a legacy of art of some sort?
Not so much.
Legacy
because,
sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But what I'm trying to say is that, how do I word this? If the worst was to happen, there's still a beautiful legacy of artwork that you've created for the world to see, whether you made it into gallery shows or not.
Well, I think...
Sorry, I apologise if that's really untactful. I don't know.
Well, no, it's fine. But someone tells you have cancer and we all know that life is going to end at some point and we don't know when, but you assume you might reach 80 if you're lucky or whatever. And maybe as an artist, you always feel like, when I'm gone, I'll be leaving something behind. There will be a record that I existed and what I created. I don't feel like that way with showing my stuff on the streets. I think it ties back into like everything is temporary. And you know when you put something on the streets, it's not going to last. but how many people will enjoy it for the day or the week or the month that it is there,
Yeah.
Like every time I go to a site where we paste up a wall or a spot or whatever, every single time there'll be people there, groups of girls taking selfies and enjoying the wall. And then I suppose they're sharing it on social media or whatever. Or I'll see people with nice cameras, serious photographers there. Or the amount of conversations I've had with people, and they've come over, oh, are you so-and-so? Oh, we love your work. We're seeing it everywhere. Everyone's loving your work. It's like you're getting that sort of feedback. Or tourists. I've met so many people from around the world who go around taking photographs of street art wherever they travel. So, I've had a lot of interesting conversations with people and meetings with people whilst out either pasting up or photographing the paste ups.
Again, something else I'd like to talk about. Arguably, you're getting more eyes on your artwork than any art gallery. Well, unless maybe it's some of the biggest art galleries in the world that are getting thousands and thousands of people through their doors a day. Again, whether people know it or not, that's a subconscious thing.
Yeah.
So people on their bus route to work or their jog through the city of whatever. And it's not just, say, Birmingham. It's cities all over the world. You've just done a weekend in London doing some paste up stuff in there. And can you tell me a little bit more about how you sort of have got like a art exchange going on with artists around the world who do paste ups?
Yeah, so one thing I really love, or one of the things I really love about paste up art is there's a real sort of community of people sharing each other's work and trying to expose each other's work to as many people around the globe as possible. So, I did a swap with a guy in Brazil, Diogo Rustov. He's a great stencil artist. And he sent me a package of his stencil creations, and I sent him a package of my screen prints. And he'll be sharing them around paste-up festivals and people all over Brazil. And I've been sharing his stuff, pasting it up around England. So it's...
And how does that sort of come about? Is that a social media thing?
Yeah,
or?
just like two artists that really like each other's work will start following each other on Instagram, and then it's like... he said, hey, do you want to do a swap? Like, this is a common thing with paste-up artists. And, he's like, I'll get your work known all over Brazil. I'm like, okay, everywhere I go, I'll share yours. So once you develop those connections with people, like Boxy Trixie, the guy that I go pasting up with, he's been a paste-up artist for like 20 years, like hardcore paste-up artist. And he has a group in Buenos Aires, BA Paste-Up. There's 6 members of the group, and I've kind of become an honorary member because I take their work. I took some to Serbia, and wherever I go, I paste all of their work. So that's another exchange. We'll be sending our work to them and vice versa.
That's very cool.
It's a really nice way to for your work to travel the world. You also have the paste up festivals, like you mentioned London. There's a London International Paste Up Festival. And the last few years, they've been including my work in their walls before I ever started to paste up. It was actually some of the guys who organised that who took me pasting up for the first time earlier this year in Manchester. And I loved it. I was instantly addicted. And I messaged Boxy and I was like, I finally went pasting up. He's like, do you want to go with me tomorrow morning? I was like, yes. And then we went the next morning and the next morning. And as often as I feel able, I've just been going out and doing it.
Amazing. And are you feeling, and presumably that's giving you extra vigor and all sorts of just...
Well, it's good exercise. And I think anything in life, you've got to have something that you're passionate about, you're excited about, and that you want to get up and do every day. So to find a new sort of avenue or an outlet for what I'm doing and what I make has been like extremely beneficial.
As a paste-up artist, do you find that the repetition of your character, I'm not saying obviously they're all slightly different, but is that important for that recognition on the streets?
I think so. I mean, I don't find myself trying to create things that are similar to put on the streets, but I tend to work in series, so that most of the characters that I've been putting on the streets are from an ongoing series of characters that I've been creating for several years now. So they obviously all look quite similar.
And what was the start of that series?
Just following mistakes and accidents. So when I started to screen print, one day I came into the studio to make a very simple 2-layer screen print, and I printed the red background 25 times. And when I came to put the second layer on, the print shop had made my positive at slightly the wrong size. So I had basically an outline, like a silhouette of a shape of a character. So I thought, well, I don't want to waste them. I'll take them home and I'll draw into them and I'll make something new. And I started to enjoy that process so much that I came in and printed more backgrounds and more backgrounds. And so for about the last 6 years, I've been on a mission to create 100 characters out of the same template. And they're basically drawn into and cut up and collage back together to create, I like that sort of limitation. Give yourself a very, like, I only use black, red, white, and all the characters come from the same shape. And I think sometimes it's good to give yourself those limitations to see what you can do with a limited palette and and one shape to work with as a starting point.
And how are you going? Have you completed the 100 or?
I've got about 86, I think, at the moment, in various stages of completion.
And have all 86, they all been turned into paste ups?
No, so each time I finish one and I finally think, yeah, that's done, I'll then start turning them into screen prints. But then when I turn them into screen prints, obviously you separate your character into layers. So then I start to experiment with them with the screen printing process.
Can we talk a little bit about that, the screen printing process? Because, there'll be people listening that don't know what we're talking about. So in the most layman terms, what is screen printing?
Screen printing is, so you have a screen on a metal frame.
And you print normally on it. I knew you were going to say that.
Well, no, but
Sorry.
You create a stencil in your screen, a process using photoemulsion and an ultraviolet light unit, and you create each layer or color of an image as a separate positive, and you use that positive and the ultraviolet light to expose a screen, to create a stencil.
Right.
So if you've got a 5-layer image, you'll create 5 screens and you'll print 1 layer at a time.
Yeah, I just thought we'd better sort of clarify that up so people can, the technicalities of the screen printing I thought was important. So you've developed these characters and, sorry, what did you say, 80? How many were?
I think I'm on about 86 at the moment. But the way I've created them, I don't sit down and draw one character and when it's finished I draw the next. I've just had a growing pile, and sometimes I might not look at them for a few months, but when I have a bit of time, I'll sit down and I might spend one evening or a few evenings in a row and I'll go through them and I'll just add a little bit to each character, whatever I can see that it needs, and I just keep going through the pile. So they've gradually, each drawing is developed over a 6 or a 5 or a 4-year period or whatever. It's quite an interesting way to work, because normally you sit down and you have one idea and it's that drawing is one sort of moment in time. But yeah, these have gradually developed and changed. Some of them look recognizable from day one, but they've just been refined.
Right.
And some of them might have changed drastically 10 times.
And how do you know when they're done?
Well, that's the magic question with anything creative, I think. Like, for me, it's really...
But you did say there was like a point where you go, oh, I'm going to turn that one into a screen print now.
Yeah.
So there must be some sort of moment.
Yeah, for me, it's... I see like every image that you make, whether it's drawing, painting, whatever, it's like a problem that you need to solve. Now, one of my friends said to me when I said that to her once, she said, a problem? That sounds like maths. That doesn't sound enjoyable. I thought art should be enjoyable. And it is enjoyable, but it's like, is it the sculptor Brancusi once said, that simplicity is just complexity resolved. Yeah. And it's like when you're trying to make an image, it's about the composition, it's about the balance, it's about how do you make this image work. And for me, it's like sometimes that takes time. Sometimes you can get it in a few lines in a minute or two. And sometimes you can like agonize over something and maybe just ruin it or overwork it. And
going back to what you said though about creativity, I've said it before, creativity for me is just problem solving essentially. Deep down at its crust, if you take what most people, oh, you were creative, they think artist, painter, poet, writer, whatever. But actually creativity is just being able to look at a problem and go, oh yeah.
Yeah, I can see what that needs.
I can see exactly what that needs. Or same with your pieces. You go, I know what that needs, to the point of getting it to where it's done.
Well, often I don't decide that it's finished. I'll just go through the pile and I go, oh, there's nothing about that one that annoys me anymore. There's nothing that feels unresolved. It's finished. Now, sometimes I'll go and scan them, separate them into layers so I can start making screen prints of them. And I'll look back at it and I'll go, oh, if only it had a thicker black line there, it would be better. But like, you can continue forever. There does come a time where you just have to go, it's good, it's fine. Like, you could take that one drawing and make 10 different variations on it that could all be just equally as good. Or you could just go and make 10 other drawings.
Done's better than perfect, isn't it, a lot of the time?
That's another thing that I just like reflecting on, like, how having cancer made me feel about artwork. I guess maybe every artist has this. I've always had this feeling personally, like I'm getting better. Like maybe this isn't quite good enough yet. You know, like I see being an artist as I'll be doing this until I die.
Constant development.
You know, yeah. So it's like you're on a journey to improve as an artist. And one thing about having cancer that made me just think, well, yes, hopefully we'll always be getting better, but it's allowed me to accept that whatever I do is good enough. Like, that's me and that's what I'm capable of doing. Like, to try not to agonize over it quite so much.
Is that a nice feeling? What's that feeling like? Because
it's just accepting yourself, really, I think, more than anything. And not thinking how it could be better or comparing it to anything else. Like, just acceptance of who you are and what you make. And
that sounds quite liberating as an artist, that it's very difficult not to compare yourself with others, isn't it? But if you can reach that feeling.
I can't remember who it was. There was some a female, like, contemporary dancer. And I read a quote from her many years ago. And she said, each individual person's expression of who they are is unique to them. Your job really is to just allow that to happen and try not to dilute it. You know, and I think for any artist, like finding your style or your voice or what you're trying to express with what you create is the whole goal, really. We all have influences. I mean, there's barely been any person ever that's seen my work and not mentioned the word Picasso. Now, I know that Picasso is like so deeply ingrained in what I do that it's there, you know, it exists. But you have to try to hopefully bring something of yourself to what you're doing as well, you know. They say that each person is like, take all of your friends and squish them together and that's who you are, sort of thing.
Yeah, they say you're the amalgamation of your 5 closest friends, aren't you?
So I think it's the same with like art, for example.
There's no new ideas. You're
5
just
or 10 favourite artists.
You're a sponge.
That's probably what you are, because none of us are unique. So,
yeah, your inputs equal your outputs. So, you know, who in the art world is not going to be influenced in some way by Picasso, whether it's his work directly or his deconstructing of, you know, he could paint anything and then he deconstructed it all back. And anyway, we don't need to go into a Picasso lesson. But yeah, I suppose that is important, isn't it? Do you think you found your voice now in what you're creating now? Or like you said, is that open and could continue to develop?
I think my work is recognisably me. But no, I think it's always a quest. I mean, I still sit in front of a canvas now and have days where I think, oh my God, I don't even know how to draw, or I don't know how to paint. You know, like, I still have those feelings. It's not like I've had some epiphany and I'm like, I'm the perfect artist now, or, you know, I love everything that I do. I still find it something that you have to work at.
And you mentioned putting limitations on your work. It's great when you're creating those characters because they're all slightly different, but you know what constraints they're in. But when you sit down at a blank canvas, do you then go, oh, I better work on this character again.
Well, sometimes with that ongoing series of 100 characters, I leave them for months at a time. Sometimes I sit and work on it and go, all right, I can't do this anymore. I need to go and do something else. I need to go and do some printing, or I need to paint or something. But yeah, I think it's like, for me, I've always worked on multiple things at once. So I'll have a few different series of things that I'm working on. I think it's really important, actually. Like, say if I'm working on a series of large collaged canvases, I like to have like 6 in a room. Because I think sometimes you can just get lost in what you're doing if you're just focusing on one piece of work. And it's really good to be able to switch to something else and then come back later to something with fresh eyes. Because sometimes you're so involved in the creation of it that you can't even see what it is anymore.
Yeah.
Or you can't see if you're destroying it. Or so sometimes
Can you talk of a time that you can remember that last happening where you just got so like overwhelmed by a canvas? Or
yeah, I would say that I have that issue constantly. That's part of the battle of like trying to beat whatever you're trying to create. Like you're trying to make something out of nothing. You go in and you just pick up a paintbrush and choose a color and start making some marks on a canvas, and it's a starting point, but you don't know what it's going to become. Like you might know it's going to be a face or a figure or a torso or something.
how's your work different to, say, going direct onto canvas to, say, screen printing?
Well, with screen printing, you already have an image that you've created. Which is one of the things I really like with screen printing is, for years, I was just drawing in sketchbooks. So I had a massive archive of imagery. So when I started to teach myself how to screen print 7-8 years ago, I was working and I wasn't being very creative. I was drawing in sketchbooks, but I didn't have the time or the space to create large canvases or anything anymore. But I had all this imagery that I liked, and I was like, oh, okay, I could start turning these into editions of prints, So I could be on my way home from work, for example, and feeling very tired and go to the studio for a few hours, and I don't have to have the focus or the energy to create something new. I can have this mechanical process where I am creating something new, but out of an image that I already have. So screen printing, what's great with screen printing is you can take a very simple image and you can do so much with it in the ways that you use different colors or the ways you might overlap that image. Or, for example, with my ongoing series of characters, if I want to turn that character into a 3-color screen print, I have 3 different layers for that character. If I've got 10 characters, then I've got 30 different layers. And because they all come from the same original source, the same family of characters, they're all similar enough. So if I take one element of one character, an element of another one, an element of this one, and I can start combining them in the printing process to make variations, to make new versions or new characters. So, I mean, this mistake that I had 6 years ago in the printing studio that led to me creating 100 characters has then led to God knows how many different screen printed variations of each character, and then combining elements of each character to make brand new characters. And I almost feel like I'm going to be creating things from that starting point, from that mistake, maybe for the rest of my life,
Interesting.
And then you take them out and put them on the streets. And say I've put a character on the street, it's been there a few months, it's a bit weathered and torn. Somebody's come along and tried to peel it off the wall to take it home, but they can't, and they've just ripped half of it off. I go along and put a new character on top, a different character, but it's basically the same size and shape. And then you'll see a bit of the original character coming through. And then I can keep doing that, like putting a new character each time. And then I start to think, how can I take this into the studio? I can start making canvases in the studio. Maybe I can attach one to a board, leave it outside to weather, let somebody graffiti on it or whatever, put a new character on top. So what I'm doing on the street and that natural occurrence of how things change and develop on the streets and it's out of your hands, trying to find a way to bring that into the studio work. So they both kind of feed into each other, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is this a good point, saying that you started the screen printing 7 or 8 years ago. Is this a good point to jump even further back and go back to art college days and an existence of what you was doing there before you found screen printing?
Well, I mean, I would go back even further than college days because, like, I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't draw or make collages or do something like that. Like, it was always like my biggest passion. Throughout school, every class, I was just sitting drawing. My teachers would confiscate my books off me, but then I would see them at the front of the class looking through my exercise books full of drawings and comic strips and enjoying them. And so there was always, I would get chastised, but also encouraged by my teachers. Like, oh, they're very good, but not in class. So I'd say there's a few sort of influences. Like, I had a great aunt Rosaline, and she lived down in Chew Magna in a little cottage in the middle of nowhere, and she looked after Father Michael. He was a deaf priest. He was an artist. And they had this wonderful cottage. I used to call her my nanny with the cows because their cottage was surrounded by fields of cows. And in the garden, they had a church, with a pipe organ and an orchard and everything.
Quintessentially English location.
Yeah, but the best thing was, she had a vicious corgi called Clancy. Every time it died, she'd get a new one, just like the Queen, and call it Clancy, and it bit everybody. But Father Michael was an artist, and he worked in metal, in drawing, in painting, in embroidery, all sorts of things. And the cottage, every surface was full of his creations. So I always loved going there. I always found it just fascinating, like what Father Michael made this time,
Inspiring to see as a kid, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's like, there's all these different ways you can create that aren't just drawing, So I think that was like a big thing. And there was a friend of the family, and he had a girlfriend at one point, an American woman. And it maybe only happened a few times, but whenever we'd go and visit them, she would sit with me and she would draw a scribble on a piece of paper and she would say, turn it into something. And then if they went on a holiday, she'd send a postcard or a letter with some scribbles for me to turn into something. So I always, like, that was sort of drummed into me when I was very young, like, you can take anything and turn it into something. And I sometimes I think back on that and think, I'm still doing that. You can just make a few random marks on a canvas. Everything starts with a few random marks, really. And then the journey is, what can it become, So, yeah, I mean, I had some influences like that when I was very young, and I drew all the way through school. When I was a teenager, me and one of my friends at school, when we were still at secondary school, we drew comics. We were really into comics, and we knew some older guys that published their own independent comic called Imagine Illustrated. We used to sell it in Nostalgia and Comics and Virgin Comics and places like. We used to sell it on the streets in Birmingham as well. So that was my big thing, was comic books and wanting to be a comic book artist when I was about 15. But then when I went to art college, I think I really lost interest in comics then.
Was that always the avenue you were going down? I was always going to go to art college. Or do you remember a time where you thought, okay, I'm always drawing comics, but how can I take this further?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because like when you're coming to the end of secondary school here, I remember being called into the headmaster's office one day. And it's, okay, this is your final year. Now, what do you want to be when you leave school? And we're going to find you a work placement. And I said, well, I'm already a comic book artist. I want to be a comic book artist. That's what I'm going to do. And they said, okay, we'll find you a placement. The placement they got me was working in a photocopy shop.
Wow, that's
so I spent several weeks,
to say the least.
Yeah,
say the least,
in a photocopy shop. So yeah, so I didn't feel any like real support in that sense. But when I finished my GCSEs, I moved with my family to Chicago. And I did another couple of years in high school there.
Oh, wow.
And I was still like drawing constantly and painting and making art.
What took your family to Chicago?
Well, my uncle, he married an American woman and moved there in the early 70s. Then my aunt followed, and my nan and granddad, and then my family followed. So like over a span of about 20 years, we all gradually moved to America.
And what age were you when you moved there?
16.
How's that going in as a 16-year-old to presumably American high school? Or
Yeah, well, I'd spent a lot of time growing up in summer holidays and things in America, so I had some understanding of what it was like to be in America. But yeah, school was a very different experience to England. It was like we went to the headmaster's office on the first day and he gave us like the rule book. And like in England, it's no running in the corridors, no spitting and shouting. In America, it was like no firearms, no Class A drugs. It was like on a whole other level. So yeah, America was an interesting experience. But when I graduated after 2 years there, because they go to school till they're 18, I knew that I wanted to go to art college. But, you know, it's so expensive. I did go and have interviews at like the Art Institute in Chicago and things like that. But do you want to be in debt for your entire life? And I knew that in England, I could still go to university for free and get a grant and everything. So I came back to England and went to art college, which was great. And, you know, obviously you try a bit of everything. And then I really started to discover more and more about the possibilities of what art can be. And I think it was probably around that time that I really lost complete interest in being a comic book artist or anything.
in what sense? Can you say more on that? What and what art can be in what way to you personally at that time?
Well, I suppose I really thought mostly of art as like a comic strip format. But then I started to see how people could be a bit more expressionistic. You know, I always loved the expressionist painters. And I fell in love with Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Had you been open to that before going to do the art?
I'd liked Van Gogh and I'd liked certain artists and I was aware of some of the big names and things like that, but I'd never really dove into it really deeply. But then suddenly I started to go to different countries to see exhibitions with the art college and different cities and see all this new stuff that was new to me, you know. Going to Versace Gallery in London in the 90s and seeing Damien Hirst and all those sorts of people. Oh, okay, you can put a shark in a tank or you can, whatever it might be.
It opens your eyes as a creative to go, actually, and I think that was a big time for obviously the big conceptual art stuff that Tracy Emin's Bed, like you say, the Damien Hirst Shark, the Chapman Brothers, all those sorts of people.
I mean, I loved the Chapman Brothers. They were probably my favourites from the young British artists.
You're
and just realising that there's so many different ways that you can say something. It doesn't have to be drawing and painting. Now, I would say, as I've grown older, my tastes have kind of narrowed again. I sort of absorbed all that stuff, and then I'm like, well, that stuff doesn't do much for me, but I still really love drawing, painting and sculpture, and mostly figurative. I mean, that's what really interests me. I'm not so much into conceptual or minimalist art or things like that. So yeah, art college obviously opens your eyes to all of these things. But yeah, it's strange. I hung around the art college for about 3 years on and off, and the tutors really liked me, so I would go back to America for several months and then I would come back to England and I'd say, oh, can I just not be enrolled but just come and use the facilities and build up my portfolio? I didn't get into university the first time around.
Do you know why?
I think I was probably a bit lazy. I mean, when I was first at art college, I would just bring my guitar to class every day and I would mostly just sit there playing the guitar.
You were that guy.
While everyone else was drawing the life model, I was like finger picking and making the model laugh, telling her stupid jokes or whatever, you know. I really got into my art in the second half of the year, but it was a bit too late. I just didn't have a great portfolio. And over the next couple of years, and then I did get into university. But I found the education system for art at that time quite strange. Like, literally the first day, they gave us some oil paints, cheap oil paints, and a small canvas and said, have a go with these. They did an exercise where they just gave us a stack of paper and a piece of charcoal and shouted out words, and you just have to scribble something really quickly for each word in a few seconds. And then apart from those 2 days, you were just left with a little space and get on with it, do something, you know. Occasionally a tutor would come or you'd have a group crit and you'd discuss your work or whatever, but...
And what sort of work were you producing then if you were left to your own devices?
I would like do left-handed drawings with my eyes closed in a sketchbook, like little doodles. And then I would project them up and turn them into huge, like, I don't know, 6-foot square paintings. I really liked the idea of taking something that was so throwaway, but reproducing it on a really large scale. And I dabbled with lots of things at uni. I did a lot of almost more like documentary filmmaking. So I worked and lived in a pub. The landlady of the pub became my girlfriend, basically. My boss became my girlfriend, and I lived there with her. So I never went to uni because we had a live music room upstairs and we lost our live music license. So the live room became my studio. So I just worked there, and I started to produce really large pieces of work. And it started to become, I think I really liked Tracy Emin and that sort of confessional art making at the time. And so a lot of I kept books for years. I have about 160 of them under my bed. So from about the age of 15, I had like a little A5 book that I carried everywhere. And it was like a journal, stroke diary, stroke sketchbook, scrapbook. And I would record like everything I did every day of my life in it.
Wow.
And then I would take either pages of writing or drawings from those or photocopies. And I would make these really sort of very deeply personal artworks of, like I broke up with the woman I lived with at the pub in the middle of my final year at uni. So everything that I was doing that my tutors loved and said, oh, you're going to get a first, we love your artwork. I was doing these big colourful paintings from my sketchbooks and my diaries. And I took this breakup really badly, and I made this huge artwork that was about maybe 10 foot tall by 16 foot long on every side. It was like an artwork you could walk around.
Wow.
So it was a huge, one side was writing and drawings from my diaries from while I was with her, and the other side was just writing. It was an enormous letter that I'd written to her when we separated. So I made this really nothing was sort of off the table.
Wow.
It was like deeply personal. And I think, for example, when my mother came to my exhibition and saw the kinds of things I was talking about, we went through some hard things, like she had an abortion and all these tough things. There was one girl who was at our university, and one day I came in early and she was standing in front of this canvas that I was writing, that I was in the middle of working on. And she was crying. And she said, oh, I come in early every morning before anyone else gets here just to read what you've added to it. I find it so beautiful and touching, And but my mom's reaction was more like, well, if he wants to put his dirty
yeah, but I suppose
washing
it's very
on
different. A parent's probably much harder to separate that. The human element of just being able to go, we all go through these masses of emotions, but artists tends to put it out there and feel perhaps less shame about putting it out there. And I'm a firm believer there's a lot of great art comes from darkness, but how did that feel being so open and vulnerable for your, say, end of year show?
I think my attitude was just that we're all essentially the same, and we all have this range of emotions and experiences that we can go through in life. And so I might be talking about some deeply personal or graphic things that are part of a relationship or a breakup, but I'm sure everybody can relate to them. Like, my experience of life isn't that much different than anybody else's. Like, we all have the potential to experience these kind of things.
And you mentioned Tracy Emin then. Obviously, she was the huge proponent of the confessional art, like you said, but was there anyone else that was influencing you at that time, or was the breakup and the heartbreak enough of an influence for you?
I didn't really feel that I was particularly influenced in making that work. So for me, it was just a natural extension of what I wrote and did in my journals every day. It was a daily thing. I really kept a record of almost every conversation I had, or even overheard conversations.
Where does that
somebody
come
on
from?
A bus.
Wanting to do that?
I don't know. I mean, I always kept a diary when I was younger, but it was like I had a personal diary that stayed in a drawer, and I had these books that I shared. Like, my books wasn't just me; my friends would write and draw in them, and it was like I had this idea when I started them, and I was I think I was 16 when I started the first one. It was on the eve of leaving England to go to America. And I just had this idea that one day I'll be old in a wheelchair and I won't be able to do anything, but I'll have this circular room. This was my fantasy, like a library, a circular room from floor to ceiling of my entire life in these series of books. And I won't go senile because I'll be able to look back on everything that I ever experienced and all the people I knew. And, I don't know, that was I don't know where that idea came from, but that was what I was thinking when I started them. So yeah, it was very natural for me to just write down my emotions, and those books were always there for like anybody around me to share or to add to or to read. Sometimes my friends would go, "Oh my God, sometimes I read things in your book and I just don't know what to say to you about it."
How interesting that you would be so open to let friends read it, friends contribute to it. Yeah, that's a really interesting... I've never heard of anyone do that in terms of... Because I suppose it's not a diary, it's not a journal, it's a history book?
Something like that. I mean, I think I've probably got some sort of OCD or something, or autism. Because looking back, like I have... When mobile phones became a thing, and I first had a phone and could send a text message, some of the books are literally just... I would write down every day every text message. It was like a whole book of just text messages. Like in some ways I wouldn't have to write about what I did that day. The text messages and the conversations I had with people in text would be the story of what was happening at that point or what was going on. Or,
Is that still something you do today?
No.
What was the thing that made you stop?
Well, interestingly, I think the last book that I did was on my honeymoon when I got married.
Okay, have we jumped ahead there?
Yeah, a little bit.
So how do we get... Okay, because I know you've got an interesting period before you got married. So after university, what's life like? It sounds quite interesting, shall we say?
Well, university, we were talking about... So I feel like whatever the system was at that time, it was really bad. It was really destructive. So when I was heading for my degree show, I went round to all the people in my year and asked them, what are you going to do? What's your next step? And almost every single person said, I don't know, but it's definitely not going to be art. And I thought, that's so sad. It's like all of these people came to university because I presume art was their big passion in life. And in 3 years, the education system has completely beat that out of them.
What do you think that's down to?
I don't know. I mean, I think there wasn't enough structure or enough sort of teaching you about the realities of how to actually survive as an artist.
There's no business. It was all... Again, I've spoken about this a lot with people who talk about their studies in art and how it's all very well, explore your ideas, what are your influences, but there was never, and I do hope it is different now, but there was never any, this is how you get clients, this is how you approach galleries, this is how you market yourself, this is how you send an invoice. There was nothing about the business side of being a creative, and that sounds like it was very similar for you.
Yeah, I mean, about 15 years ago, I saw this great BBC documentary. It was a 2-part documentary, and they went to St. Martin's in London. And the first episode was like a handful of their master's degree students heading for their final exhibition. And then they came back, I think, 6 months or something later to see what had happened to each of them, or maybe a year. And some of them had just been in a studio 24/7, studiously working away at their craft and making their paintings. And some of them had been going to every party, every exhibition opening, drinking people, getting to know people. And those people were making really nonsense non-work. They were really producing very little. But on their CV, they'd been in 20 group shows with, I don't know, the one I remember was a guy had a fin from a swordfish and he'd stuck it through a basketball and he put it in the corner of a gallery. and gave it some pretentious title. But this guy was at every opening, hobnobbing and getting drunk and becoming friends with everyone. So on paper, as an artist, he was doing so much better than the artists who were really being artists.
Who you know, what not what you know.
Well, yeah, I think like to be successful as an artist, you've got to have a whole list of things. So number one, you've got to have some kind of talent, whatever that is. And then you've also got to have the belief and the drive and the passion and the interest to do that thing all the time, to become really good at it and to develop whoever you are as an artist.
And at this time, leaving university, did you have that? When you're going around asking these people and they're saying, I don't know what I'm going to do, but it's not art.
Well, at that time,
are you feeling the same?
No, I was like, what? What do you mean you're not going to do art? I'm going to like go out. My plan at the time was to return to Chicago. I was going around to everyone saying, I'm going to go back to Chicago and I'm going to sell big paintings to rich, fat Americans. You know, that was my attitude. Well, I didn't go back to Chicago. I got a studio. Oh, it's ridiculous looking back. So I was there from about 2001 to 2004. Now, I got some crappy jobs for an agency in a warehouse or something to get a bit of money together, and I got this studio. And then I said to my boss, oh, well, I need to make my artwork, so can I just work 3 days a week, 4 days a week? Then it gradually got smaller and smaller until I just thought, what am I doing going to work when I should just be in my studio all the time? So I just started living there. You know, I had a cold tap and free electricity and a massive studio. So I dragged a sofa in off the street. It was pretty rough, really. I mean, I slept on the 2 cushions of the sofa on the floor, literally with my coat rolled up as a pillow.
Oh, wow.
And like, I didn't even have a blanket to begin with. I just literally covered myself
but you were suffering for your art,
sheet of
Mark.
canvas, you know. But, you know, I loved it. You know, I had a drum kit and guitar amps and all my paintings everywhere. And every day I woke up and if I was awake, I was doing what I loved. Now, I was probably malnourished and like not doing too well on that kind of level. But I was extremely happy just to be able to devote myself to art and music.
And again, what sort of stuff are you creating at this point?
Large paintings, very colourful, very bold. Again, they all originated from my little books, my diaries. Yeah. So a lot of them would be tiny little doodles that I would then blow up onto large canvases. There was a series I was doing of like, me and my friends sat up through the night that America went and did their shock and awe bombing of Baghdad. And I did page after page of little cartoony doodles of Mickey Mouse driving a tank, or the Grim Reaper in a tank, or there was like a guy flying on a rocket,
right,
with a hamburger for a head, and
very
it said
naked
"We
gun.
bomb in peace." It was all that sort of stuff. So I was doing a lot of big things like that, and then to counterbalance that, I did a whole series of large canvases of cartoon characters having bizarre sex. You know, it's kind of like a bit of love and hate going on.
What was that series called?
I think it was just called The Fucking Series or something, You know. My favourite one was, it was like a 6-foot painting of Batman with no arms and like a 4-foot cock fucking something, I don't know, some paraplegic woman. You know, it was pretty crazy stuff
out there. Well, explicit material box ticked for this podcast then, for sure. Going back to that though, that sounds like, it sort of sounds like every artist's dream in a way, waking up, just being in the studio, creating what you love. You would do music as well at the same time.
Yeah. So I was always making music, you know, having bands or performing myself or with different configurations of people.
And do you think your love of music contributed to the fact that you enjoyed journaling, you enjoyed writing so much, the songwriting, not necessarily songwriting, but listening to lyrics all the time? And who are some of the influences, do you think? I mean, we're sat here and people won't be able to see, but I'm looking at a huge record collection, all beautifully bagged up. So Mark has got a huge passion for music. But when you're writing those, is there any musical influences that you can think of?
For me, it's all about the lyric writers, really. I mean, I love instrumental music as well, but growing up, I loved Dylan and Cohen and Morrissey and some of these people that either when you hear their voice or you read their lyrics, you know within a syllable who it is.
Yeah.
Like people who are very sort of distinctive. I'm not saying that I was comparing myself to them or anything, but there was probably some element of those.
Well, it goes
kind of
back to what we
people
were
in
saying
there.
earlier about influences. We're a product of our influences, so you will be influenced by your favourite people because that's who we want to emulate, right?
Yeah. But because I was writing every day in my books, sometimes that would be a normal journal entry. Sometimes it would be something a bit more creative. I was always writing, whether it was that or song lyrics. You know, I was writing songs for years. I had an interesting project with a friend from art college, actually. He was a Norwegian guy. And after we graduated, he went to Sweden to avoid having to be drafted. And I would go over and spend time in Sweden with him. And we had a project called the Me Band. And so we would work long distance. We would send each other files in the late 90s, early 2000s, when that kind of thing was a new sort of possibility. So he'd send me some beats and I would record some vocals or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it expanded and we started to get other people from around the world. We'd send them a track and they'd add a mandolin or
Similar to
a
your
vocal
paste
or-
ups, sharing
Yeah,
bits
it's like-
that you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very similar, actually. So, yeah, for a long time I was doing that kind of thing.
How are you funding this lifestyle? Was it still with bits of
I think after I walked out of that job in the warehouse, the doll wouldn't give me any money even because I'd left the job. So I don't know. Looking back, I'm not sure how I survived at all. I didn't have anything, but
beg, borrow, and stole?
somehow I managed to exist.
Yeah,
You know, I was purely existing, but
happy,
yeah.
which
But,
sometimes more important, right?
But yeah, eventually I got kicked out of that studio at 2004, and I moved with some friends. A friend of mine, he found a big house. He was like, "Do you want to move in? There's room to have a music studio and a painting studio." I was like, "Yeah." And I lived there for like several years. But yeah, I kind of reached a point. Like at one point, my music almost got released by EMI. And
Oh, wow.
And it fell through. So that was in 2000, 2001.
And what sort of music were you creating?
This was the Me Band project. We sent out 3 or 4 demos in 2000 to like the 3 or 4 major labels. And EMI got back to us. So I went back over to Sweden. We met with them. And they wanted me to animate a video for the first single. And so we did that. And on the eve of the first single's release, we got dropped. EMI had this massive loss in the stock market at the time where they lost billions. And suddenly, the day I was supposed to get the call they were going to fly me out to Stockholm to put a new lead vocal on the first single, I called my mate saying, "What's happening?" And he said, "The guys just called me and I don't know, the head of EMI has told them they've got to drop everyone on their books that hasn't been released yet." So...
How did that feel?
Oh man, it was like growing up, there was no doubt in my mind that I was going to be a famous musician or artist or both. And I just thought, well, it's happening. I always knew this would happen. And when that happened, oh man, it was like gutting. I felt like I'd just been stood up at the altar. It was that kind of feeling. I didn't make any music for about 6 months or pick up the guitar. I was like, oh fuck. And then 10 years later, a similar thing happened with my art. So a friend of mine became friends with, I won't say her name, but a relative of the Freud family. Mm-hmm. And she worked in the art world as a curator, like big exhibitions all over the world and selling through the auction houses in London. And my friend contacted me and said, so my friend, blah, 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 Freud, she'd like to come and see your works. I've been telling her about you. And I think it was like my 34th birthday. So I just plastered every wall of my house with all of my paintings. And she came in and she was like, "Oh, Mark, you're very talented. Like, I have this huge house I've just bought in Wales, in a little hamlet, and I have a spare wing that you can come and live in if you'd like, and I could sell your work." And I was like, oh man, all my artistic dreams are coming true. I moved all my stuff there, and I gave up my house, and I went out with friends for drinks. And as I was having my first drink, I messaged the woman to tell her what time we were coming in the morning. And she replied back, "Dear Mark, I'm terribly sorry." She'd broken up with her boyfriend. So she'd bought this huge house in this hamlet, and her boyfriend was like, his career was in hotels. She knew nothing about hotels, but she just had lots of money from her career as a curator. And they'd split up. And she'd spent all this money on this house, and she's like, "I can't do it without him. I'm going to have to let the house go. I'm so sorry." Her whole life just kind of fell apart. So 10 years after my musical dreams fell apart at the last minute, the same thing happened with So I suddenly found myself in Birmingham without a home or a studio and wondering what to do.
So what does one do at that point?
I went to Serbia.
Yeah. Okay.
So
say more. What was in Serbia?
So I don't know how much I should say about this, but
Are you a spy?
No, but I'd shared a studio with a Croatian painter for about 5 years, and she had a considerably older Serbian husband, and she would bring his nice, expensive cameras to take photographs of our artworks, and then she'd go home and use his computer to transfer them in and blah, blah, blah. So he started to see my artwork, and he's like, "Oh, I like this guy's work." So they'd left Serbia in like 1991 when the war started there. And he would return there. He was a businessman. And he would return there. And he was in this little out-of-the-place village on like the southern border near Dimitrograd. And he was walking down these like bombed streets. And he came across this little gallery. And he was so inspired that there was still a gallery, an artist creating stuff in the middle of their country like being torn into pieces, that he started to fund them. So he would fund these painters' colonies every summer at this 16th century monastery in a place called Pogonov.
Wow.
And he was like, "I'd like to send this guy to one of the painters' colonies." So they invited me around for dinner a couple of times. We got along fine, and I gave him a nice canvas, and, you know, I was appreciative. And so he arranged for me to go to this colony, and then he arranged for me to go to a second colony. So that summer I went to Serbia and spent like a month or so going to these painters' colonies, which was a really interesting experience. When I was talking to the different artists I met there about our experiences of the art education system, for example, it's very structured and very serious there, and very traditional, I suppose. They said in the first year you were only allowed to draw with charcoal. In the second year, they would allow you to use acrylic paints. And in the third year, you would graduate to oil paints. But I think for like Serbia, like it's a poor country and it's had a very difficult history. And most people either don't have a job, or even if you have a good education and a good job, you earn very little money. So if you want to be an artist, you have to think about it as in a way of, how can I make this into money? So a lot of the artists that lived in little villages or more rural parts of the country, they would get very good at painting horses or flowers, because people there would love a painting of their favourite horse or whatever. So it was a very different, you know, when I told them that, at university in England, they gave us some oil paints for one day and said, "Have a go." And that was it. And then we just did whatever we felt like for 3 years. They thought I was joking. They couldn't believe that's not teaching anybody anything about art.
Well, it's almost like two extremes, isn't it? It's like, you're only going to have charcoal, you're only going to have acrylic, you're only going to have oils, but within those years, we're going to make you proficient at anything that you can go, and if someone wants you to draw, it's almost like, the brief is drawing the horse. Okay, great, I can draw the horse or the flower or whatever. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is there's no business, but it's all about your ideas, and just be left to your own devices and be creative and free. But it's almost like there needs to be the middle ground somewhere between the two.
Yeah. I mean, in England, like I was saying earlier about, like, I like to give myself sort of restrictions to work within. And I think it's the same with music or anything. Like, back in the 60s, a lot of music I like that was just recorded on 2 tracks or 4 tracks. You had limitations, so it made you have to be decisive. You know, it made you have to think about what you wanted to do, and you would mostly just be recording a performance in a room live.
Yeah.
And there was little option to do much else, you know. And I think like having those restrictions makes you be more creative in what you can do.
I agree. I
And
remember...
like these days, you've got like unlimited. You could have thousands of tracks, digital recording, but how do you finish? You can always tinker with it. You can always change it. You can always add 10 more things, but maybe it only needed 4 elements instead of 50. You know.
Yeah, William Eggleston, American photographer, he had this rule: he'd only ever take 1 shot.
Mm-hmm.
And
Same with Andrei Kertész, the Hungarian photographer. I loved him, and most of his photographs were 1 shot of something. You know,
Eggleston always argued film was fucking expensive.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, there is that as well.
And also the edit process. Why, you know, in Eggleston's work, you know, it might be a picture of a road sign. Why would he need 15 pictures of the same road sign just from ever so slight different angles? It makes editing a nightmare.
Well, that's the thing, though, isn't it? You can take a million pictures and then you can edit it in a million different ways, or you can take a part of this picture and a part of that picture and put them together. It's the same with like, I mean, I've always enjoyed collage.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people do digital collage, which I kind of think it takes away. I much prefer analog collage because you have these things that only exist in that size or that, and if you can find a way to put them together to make something interesting, that's great. But when you can change the size of something and manipulate things endlessly, I think you lose the magic. You know, these 2 things that I just found, these physical items, I've made something new out of them.
But we've digressed from your Serbia, your patron.
Oh yeah, so
interesting
So
story.
I ended up living in Serbia for a while. I got a job as an English teacher in a private school. I was still drawing and making art and stuff, but I no longer had a studio and I wasn't making large canvases or anything like that. So I'd say this was the beginning of me really only producing sketchbook work for a number of years. And, you know, then getting married and getting a normal job and kind of trying to be a responsible person.
Okay, I feel like we've missed a bit before you got married.
So I met literally the first woman I met in Serbia, I ended up marrying.
You fell in love with the first woman you met in Serbia.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I landed in Belgrade. I don't know how relevant this is. You can edit it out, but I landed in Belgrade and the Serbian husband had told me, when you get to the airport, because he was constantly back and forth with business, this is how much it will cost to get 20 euros to get a taxi into Belgrade. Don't let them charge you anything more. As soon as they see that you're English, they'll try and charge you more. So I got there and it was like the last flight. It was like 11:30, 12 at night or whatever. Asked for a taxi driver and he said 50 euros. I said, no, I know it's 20 euros. He's like, no, it's 50 euros. And I was like, I'm not paying 50 euros. So there was a guy there, an American guy. And I said, do you want to share a taxi? He's like, oh, I'm waiting for a lift. And then his friends came and he went off. And I'm like, oh man, I'm stranded at the airport. There's no one else around. It's the end of the night. Then this guy came back 5 minutes later. He was like, oh, my friends will give you a lift. So we got in the car and he sat in the back kissing with his girlfriend, and her best friend has driven her to the airport to pick him up. So I'm sat in the front with her poodle on my lap, and the whole drive into Belgrade, she's telling me like, oh, this is this, and this is the history of Belgrade. And the next day I just bumped into her on the street.
Oh, wow.
In a city of like 2 million plus people. I just walked past her. I recognised the poodle, and she said, oh, do you want to come to mine tonight? I was only going to be in Belgrade for one night before I went to the painters' colony down south. So yeah, first Serbian I really spoke to, I ended up marrying. So
wow.
I ended up living with her in Belgrade, being an English teacher, and basically realising that all the years that I'd spent on the dole in England, thinking that I understood what it meant to be a starving, poor artist, I didn't have a clue. It was only when I lived in Serbia that I realised how incredibly lucky I was to be born British. You know, like, I had experiences there where I really understood what it meant to have nothing and to really be literally starving.
Yeah.
It's a difficult country to exist in. They've had a very sort of traumatic history. And
How did the Serbian people respond to you as an artist, a creative, an Englishman coming in?
I had really positive experiences.
But I know you were an English teacher as well as doing art, but were you selling in these galleries? Were you making
I was in
money
some
from your art?
exhibitions out there and stuff. I wasn't really making money out there from art, I don't think. Most artists in Belgrade, they were like going to Moscow because you just can't sell your work for any decent money in Belgrade. Even if you're an incredible artist, mate, a beautiful oil painting on canvas, you're not going to get more than €1,000. Nobody can afford to spend. So if you really want to make it as an artist, they mostly go to Russia where the money is.
Find your customer.
Yeah. So it's difficult to sell work for anything that was for any decent amount of money over there. But the art scene over there is really thriving, and I met a lot of cool artists, and I'm still friends with some of them to this day.
Any paste-up artists over in Serbia?
No, I didn't. I wasn't. Paste-up art wasn't really on my radar at that point. This was like 2010, 2011.
No, I mean, but you might, obviously, with your connections now with other artists, have you looked into some Serbian paste-up artists that you could do some exchanging with?
No. Paste-up art, I mean, it's even the same here in Birmingham. There's graffiti everywhere, but paste-up artists are few and far between. Like, it's quite big in, say, London. Suddenly everybody wants to be a paste-up artist. Like, most of them don't come from even an artistic background, it seems. Like, they just enjoy taking an image that they found on the internet and making a sticker of it or printing it out. And, like you were saying earlier about what's the importance of paste-up art, of a recognisable image. Like a lot of paste-up artists, they'll literally have one character, the exact same drawing over and over again, and they just print it off and they plaster it all over the world. And it's almost like branding or just a logo. Oh, that's the guy that does the fish. That's the guy that does the mushroom. So you just recognise these logos. It's a little bit less about the creative. It's a bit more about, I guess, tagging or anything where it's like, I was here. Like.
And how do you feel as an artist who said your work's a bit more complex than that? There's a bit more meaning behind it, say. So
I wouldn't even necessarily say that there's more meaning behind what I do, but for me, I'm coming at it from an artistic background. I'm coming at it from the stuff I put on the streets is something I've created myself. And it's also everything I put out there is something that I've made by hand. It might be a reproduction, but it's something I've pulled by hand.
Yeah.
It's a screen print that I've made. And I think for me, there's something important about that. I think just anybody can get a photocopier or get a shop to print off 100 photocopies of an image that they like, a cartoon character that they like, or something like that. Maybe they'll slightly modify it or something. I don't find that too interesting personally. I like to see people putting something they've created themselves out into the world.
Yeah.
I find it a bit redundant otherwise.
Yeah.
But it's like with the paste-up thing, you might have an enormous wall. Like we have one by the custard factory that we've been adding to and freshening up all year. Boxy Trixie started it about a year ago and then other people came along and added to it. But largely it's been him and I pasting up artists from Buenos Aires and our own work and some British artists we know, and a woman that I became friends with this year from Hong Kong who started going out with us, and her characters that she screen printed in our studio.
So how did you find yourself back in Birmingham then? Because obviously now we're talking about back screen printing, and you've obviously perhaps stopped doing the larger scale pieces. You've been in Serbia, English teacher. How do we get from Serbia as an English teacher back to England?
Falling in love, wanting to start a family, getting married. My ex-wife didn't have any family. So if we wanted to raise children, we wanted to raise them somewhere where they would have an extended family. And obviously Serbia was very tough. My ex was very well educated and she was a teacher, but she struggled to earn, even as a full-time teacher, like 250, 300 euros a month. And you're living in the centre of a capital city where basic everyday stuff, food, etc., is more expensive than it is here in Birmingham. I mean, one thing I love about Serbian people, like, they're super resilient and positive and proactive. Like, they have to be. Like, the odds are really stacked against them in so many ways. And artists that I met out there who just kept plugging away, kept organising their own exhibitions, just don't stop. Some of them I still know to this day. They're still producing great work. So yeah, Serbia was a very tough place to survive. So it seemed the obvious step to return to England, and where we'd have more options or whatever. So that's why I ended up back in England. But now I'm married, have a job and responsibilities more than I've ever had in my life.
How does that affect your art practice?
Sometimes I was just too busy to really be making art anymore. I didn't have a studio. I didn't have anywhere to make large-scale artworks anymore. But I would still keep sketchbooks, and I was still producing things. And I think that's what really led me to screen printing, because I had this growing archive of imagery that I loved. But for me, like, my sketchbooks, like, I'll never sell my drawings. You know, like, my drawings are like a visual diary, I suppose. I might not be drawing what's happening in my life, but you can see, like, when I first fell in love with my Serbian ex, suddenly all my artwork became really colourful with happy faces.
Yeah.
And now, as that relationship soured over time, suddenly the artwork became black and jagged and screaming faces. And, you know, like...
But so, all of which provides inspiration, whether not instantly, later down the line.
Yeah. It's like, it's not autobiographical, but there's something in the style of what you're doing. It might always be a face, but you can see in that face how you're feeling yourself in that period of your life. So yeah, so I just had all this stockpile material, and I wanted to be able to sell it, really. Right. And I'd always been interested in screen printing. I mean, Andy Warhol was one of my very favourite artists when I became an art student. So I'd always loved what you could do with screen printing. And
had you done screen printing before?
I tried it once at university, but I had a really negative experience. There was a woman who ran the print department of our art school, and literally the first time I was pulling my first screen print, she just came over to me and said, "Boy, you'll never be a printmaker. You're way too messy." And I was like, thanks for the encouragement. And just made me feel very unwelcome in her studio. Right. And so I didn't screen print again for like 20 years. So I discovered this studio I'm a member of now, Birmingham Printmakers, which has existed since like the early 80s, various locations in Birmingham city centre. And it's just an artist-led studio with facilities for lino printing, dry point etching, screen printing, etc. And really, it's supposed to be a studio for like experienced printmakers, but I fibbed a little bit. I said, yeah, I've got a bit of previous experience. I just need a bit of a refresher. So I joined, I did a workshop with them, and then I had many, many sessions of like being very frustrated because I didn't know what I was doing.
Did you have the other people showing you the ropes though?
A little here and there. Sometimes someone would go, well, you're just holding the squeegee the wrong angle, or, you know, like fundamental stuff. So yeah, then I started to get into screen printing, and it's like one of the best things I've ever done as an artist, I think. I mean, it really changed how I started to think about different ways that you can create an image. I guess everything I'd make stems from drawing, so everything's always been about the line. And when I started to work in screen printing, and you're breaking images down into its separate elements and shapes, I really started to see different ways that you could present the same image, but not necessarily needing all the lines, like making out of shapes of colour instead and things like this. So there's that aspect of it, but also with screen printing, you know, that you can take one simple line drawing, but in the different ways that you can overlap or build up one character in different sizes with different colours. Like, you can get so much variety or so much mileage out of one drawing or one image.
Do you think there's more room to experiment?
I think you can experiment with with anything. Like,
But I'm going back to how that one mistake that you made when you were screen printing has led to a
oh, of course, yeah. I mean,
100-face project.
Yeah. Well, of course, yeah. I mean, when you're screen printing, you have your nice paper that you print your good prints on, and you have your cheap, thin newsprint paper. So generally, when you start pulling a certain screen or a certain layer, you'll pull a bunch of test images onto newsprint to get the ink all flowing through the screen nicely before you go onto your decent paper. And then sometimes you end up with layers from different characters or different images on the same piece of newsprint. And often I would be in the studio trying to create an edition of 20 perfect prints, all exactly the same of one thing. And I'd be very happy if I got it right. You'd pull your hair out, you'd have a lot of wasted sessions going, I don't know what I'm doing, but when it works, it's so satisfying. And somebody would come in and I'd say, hey, what do you think of this edition I've just made? They're perfect. So, oh yeah, they're really good. But then they'd look at all the crappy random test prints that I'd pulled and they go, oh, these are really good though. You know, and sometimes I would recognize myself like, oh, I've just put part of that face and part of that face on top of each other on a test print that I wasn't thinking about. Wow, that's a lot more interesting than the one face I was intending to print. So it's just recognizing those little mistakes or those little parts of that happen during the process can often lead you to making something a lot more interesting than what you intended to make. Yeah. But I think that's true with all artwork, really. I think with screen printing, I think people that don't like screen printing is because they find it a bit too mechanical. But it's like you see with Andy Warhol. He would have one screen and he would repeat it 50 times or 20 times on a canvas. And the first one might look like a perfect representation, but after you've pulled 15, the screen's getting clogged and it starts to look dirty, or part of an image is missing, or it gets really black, or, you know, you can't see that it's a face anymore. So, like, yes, it's one screen and one image, but there's many different ways you can make that print look. If you want it to look bad, you know, you can allow it to be bad. So there's a whole range. Do you want to make absolutely perfect, almost graphic prints? If you want to do that, then the argument can be that, well, why don't you just make a digital print then? Like a lot of people, I've kind of, when I started to screen print, I guess there's that desire to make perfect prints because you're trying to prove to yourself that you can do it. But once you know how to do it, then I found personally that, well, then you can relax. It's like, yeah, I know I can make a perfect print, but not anybody can make an imperfect print that's really good. You know, so it's like recognizing that sometimes something not being perfectly registered or not being a perfect pull really adds to the overall look of it. It shows that it's handmade. It shows the process of how you've built this image up. Yeah. And the things I'm making more recently, where I'm screen printing multiple layers, again kind of came from mistakes. This year I started to produce large screen prints for the first time, like 100 by 70 centimeters. And that was a bit of a steep learning curve to suddenly go from several years of making A3 prints to making something that big.
And what is the difference between making an A3 print to making one that's a meter?
Well, I mean, there's a few different parts. With screen printing, everything is about the preparation of your screen, really, and the image. So you make your positives generally by having each layer printed with toner ink onto acetate or tracing paper, so that when you're attaching it to your screen in the ultraviolet light unit and you're exposing it, the light can't get through the black, but it will get through the acetate. And then whatever the black is, when you wash the screen out, you created your stencil. But it's quite expensive to get those positives made. Prohibitively expensive if you want to go any bigger than A3, which was largely the main reason why I didn't make bigger prints for years. Early this year, I discovered that if you print your positives on very thin paper, you can make really large images. So I had a lot of wasted sessions trying to figure out the right amount of time to expose the screens using different types of emulsion, different types of paper, different types, everything. and finally cracked it. So now I can make large prints for a lot cheaper than it was costing me to make smaller prints.
Wow.
As far as having your positives printed for you. So that was a big game changer. And it just coincided with me also starting to do paste ups. So I'd amassed for a few years hundreds and hundreds of smallish A3 things that I could print on the streets. But obviously when you're pasting up on the streets in these big open spaces, something A3 doesn't really have any impact. So it was really great to suddenly be able to start creating these bigger things that would be the size of a door almost, or could be seen. A lot of the thing with paste up art is documenting it, because it won't last very long. So you go out and you photograph it, and you want to show it where it exists.
Yeah.
You don't just want a close-up picture of your print. You want to show the building it's on, the street that it's on, the setting. And it's a lot more effective if you're making larger prints. So yeah, I was learning how to make larger prints, but then I'd always pulled everything by hand. When you're getting to that size and you're having to pull sideways on a screen, you just can't pull a squeegee that big and get a uniform, nice print. So you're having to learn to use a mechanical arm and, blah, blah, blah. So there was an amount of kind of learning how to work on that scale.
And that learning, though, that's taken you to not just be a member of Birmingham Printmakers, you kind of run it and run workshops and try and help other artists, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I run it. We have a committee, and I've become the chairperson of the committee. I'm like the membership secretary, and I'll help out like with workshops and things like that. I've reached a point where I started to, when you become a member, you attend a workshop to see how the equipment works. I'm sometimes teaching people for the first time how to screen print, or it might be somebody that hasn't done it for a long time.
Do you find that rewarding?
Yeah, very rewarding. It's like, I always feel like I'm learning as well.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah.
What's that like? Because you must have such a variety of people who've never screen printed, never created any art before even maybe, and just wanted to have a go. What's that like, being surrounded by such a variety of levels, and presumably they're all coming with a different visual influence?
Yeah, well, we have a wide range of people. We have people come who are very experienced printmakers. We have people that have never drawn anything in their life, or maybe they're about to retire and they're just trying new things because they're looking for new interests, and everything in between. Or maybe we'll have someone come in who's a liner printer or an etcher, but they've never done screen printing. Sometimes people come in with their positives and they haven't printed them on acetate the way I've instructed. I had one guy come in and he just had an acetate and he just done this scribbly drawing, and he created like the sky with bits of torn up envelope stuck on with sellotape, and he'd cut out a cornflake packet and stuck a bit of cardboard on there. And I was like, oh my God, this isn't going to work. But we found a way to make it work, and the prints came out really interesting. So like sometimes you're thrown a curveball and you're like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I could start doing things like that. So sometimes because someone doesn't know what they're doing, they approach something in a completely naive way that ends up being really interesting.
And like we said at the beginning, creativity with a capital C, it's problem solving. You solved that problem and came out with some wicked prints.
And also just taking something like me learning how to make big prints on a larger scale. I was pulling prints and they wouldn't be perfect. I'm trying to make a big print that hopefully I can sell for a nice amount of money. I want it to be high quality. And I would pull a print and there'd be like a couple of things that were just slightly imperfect about it. Now, anyone else would go, oh, it's fine. But for my standards, it's like, no, that's not fine. Like, I want whatever I'm putting out there. If I want it to be perfect, it's going to be perfect. So I'd have all these prints on like expensive cotton paper that's £5 a sheet. And much like that whole series of characters started, it's like, well, okay, this is getting really frustrating not being able to do this, but I don't want to waste that. So then I'd just take a screen of a different part of a different character and put it on top. And then suddenly there's this liberating freedom of like, well, this is a ruined print, so I'm just going to pull a bad print on top. And then I'm going to pull another bad print on top. And then suddenly people started coming and going, oh, can I buy that? I love that. And I'm like, no, that's just a crap print that I made that I thought I'd just pull some extra layers onto, and then I might take it into my studio and draw and paint over it. But then I started to see it through other people's eyes. Like, sometimes I think as an artist, you can get so lost on the thing that you're aiming to make that you might not recognize what the thing is during the process.
Or what other people can see in it that you can't.
Yeah, of course, yeah. It's like you're so focused on your end goal that you don't recognize that maybe it's already good at stage 2, or stage 7. So it's
So is that something you're playing with a bit more, loosening
a
the
lot
reins?
more now, yeah. And and again, it kind of comes from the fact that I wasn't able to do what I wanted to do. But now I've got maybe a dozen of these large prints that started off as an imperfect print that annoyed me. And now they've become these more painterly, layered works. But again, because they come from the same family of characters, they're all similar enough that you can take any part of any of them and combine them in maybe 12 or 13 layers. And it might be quite abstract and it might be quite loose. And also just embracing pulling something and just going, it's crap, but it looks incredible. So there's something really nice about that, not stressing about is something perfect, and realizing that actually allowing it to be wrong can make it a lot better in many ways.
Well, like you say, sometimes we don't see those things that other people see in them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've covered quite a lot. We've covered a whole lot, and I want to thank you for doing this, first and foremost. Is there anything you think we need to know about you and your journey that I haven't asked?
And nothing particularly springs to mind. I think I've always felt like I'm an artist, and I've always felt very lucky that I've had art in my life.
Okay, say more about that.
I think whatever it is in life that like gives purpose to your existence, like if you have something, whether that's your children or a job that you love or some sort of creative outlet, whatever that thing is that makes you want to continue to live because you want to get better at this thing, you want to like pursue something, I've never thought, oh, this is just something I enjoy doing. I've always thought, this is something I'm going to do until I'm not here anymore. This is something that I'm just going to pursue. And I don't even know if getting better or improving is really the right way to express it. But, I realised when I found out that I had cancer, but I've always known that I want to make art. And I've always known what I want to do with my life and my time, but that has become even more heightened to me now. And really, when it comes down to it, I'd like to see a bit more of the world, and I'd like to like spend time with the people I care about. But my main personal thing is I want to make more art. I want to keep doing that thing. And if I die and I've made some things that I'm really proud of, then I think that's like a life well spent.
Well, going back to one of your favourite artists, Andy Warhol, who said it's not about living forever, it's about creating something else that does.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think it's also, Chuck Close, I read something he said in an interview many years ago, and he said that waiting for inspiration as an artist is for amateurs. That's not being an artist. Like being an artist, turning up, rolling up your sleeves, and putting the time and the work in. That's what being an artist is. I mean, I love going to retrospectives of an artist's life's work. Even if it's an artist that I don't like, there's still something impressive about walking through the history of someone's life, exploring what they can make as an artist. And there's something admirable about that. It's like if you see some old couple who have been together 70 years or something, there's something beautiful about you've devoted yourself to one person. And I think it's the same with art. Like you devote yourself to this one pursuit. And even if it's like at the expense of, I don't know, having a family or spending much time with your friends or living a comfortable life, like that will always be your priority.
Would you say you've sacrificed to keep art as your purpose?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like, even if it's on a small or a larger scale, like, if a friend says, hey, come out for drinks tonight, I'm always thinking, how much will I spend in the pub and how much paper or ink or paint could I buy for that? So, yeah, it's always up there. And, you know, like, I think times when I have lived in abject poverty, like, that was a choice because it was more important for me to make those paintings than it was to have a nice car or have a nice home or anything like that. So yeah, I would say definitely. I think Cezanne, he married, I think she was his model for years. And when he married her, he said, I'll marry you, but you must understand that you'll always come second to my painting.
Yeah.
And I think for anybody that's truly an artist, that is kind of the case. Like, that's your life obsession.
I agree.
Like, that's your one relationship that will never end.
The one true north. Yeah, I'm going to say it again. That's been super interesting. I do have a little closing tradition for the Creative Noeland podcast. I like the guests to come up with some sort of inspiring quote that's perhaps sat with you, and also a suggestion of someone in your network who you think would be an interesting guest to then come on the Creative Noeland podcast.
Okay.
In any order you like.
I would say for the quote, there's one quote that I've loved for decades, and I believe it was something that Bob Dylan said, I think before he even became super successful. And he said that a successful man is somebody who wakes up in the morning and goes to bed at night and in between does what they love. And I think it's really true.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's perfect. And you've kind of lived that life.
Well, I do my best to. Yeah, I do my best to. And I hope that, you know, I'll find a way to... I mean, you know, I've been off work with illness now for like 16 months. And being able to kind of go to the studio, have that place to go to and that thing to do, you know, like I got a painting studio a year ago. And initially I was just too weak to even cut a piece of canvas and staple it to the wall. You know, I just couldn't do anything. And I haven't produced much in that studio, but knowing that I have that space there as I'm getting stronger has been like helpful. Just knowing that space is waiting for me, even if I'm not using it very much, you know.
And how are you feeling now? Just
still pretty weak.
Really?
It's like taking a long time to just kind of, you know, being inactive for so long and is, I think, the main thing to overcome now. But being able to make art and have that outlet has just been invaluable, really.
You've already said in the podcast that it's given you that time, but also, you know, it's always been deep down your purpose, but perhaps the illness has given you...
Yeah, so like having all this time, even if I just can't get off the sofa for a week, I've got a stack of these characters that I'm slowly chipping away at and creating. It's something I can do. I don't know how I would have got through this experience if I didn't have art. I can't imagine how I'd have lived my life if I didn't have art in my life. Like, I really can't. And I've always felt lucky to have art in my life. And I'm sure I always will have art in my life. So it's, for me, it's like I've had a taste of this is what my life's meant to be. Like, I'm about to go back to work soon, and that's going to be an adjustment in itself. But for me, like, I guess moving forward is trying to find a way to spend more of my time making art. That's what I'm meant to be doing. That's my work.
Are you worried about your ability to make art and be back
Well,
at
I
work?
know that, you know, having a full-time job is going to monopolise the vast majority of my time. I mean, I'll still continue to make art as often as I possibly can.
Yeah. And someone in your network that you think might be an interesting guest?
Well, there's somebody I've been communicating with, a young artist. He's about 24, 25. His name's Mason Newman. He's about to become a member of our studio. He looks like he's doing very well. And yeah, it's inspiring to see somebody who's relatively young making a success of being an artist. So yeah, I would recommend asking him to do a podcast.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Hopefully, like you say, that's what we're all trying to aspire to hopefully be.
Yep.
Making our art, our living, our purpose, and something we can use to sustain ourselves, I guess.
Well, I think the reward of art is making art. But if you can find a way to get paid to do that so you can spend even more time making art, then that's got to be the ultimate goal.
Well, I think that's a bloody good place for us to call it a day there with that words of wisdom. Mark, thank you very much indeed for doing the podcast, and I will include links to everywhere people can check out your work moving forward. Is there anywhere you'd like to point them?
Mark Wilkinson Artist on Instagram.
I can share all that, don't worry. It's easier just to say all that. And if people potentially want to come and do a taster session with the Birmingham printmakers, how can they contact you to do that?
Just look up Birmingham printmakers online.
And you'll find Mark and he'll give you an intricate lesson on the wonderful world of printing.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you very much indeed, mate. Appreciate you.
Yeah, it's been fun talking. Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Noahland podcast. If you found anything inspiring or useful in this episode, please consider subscribing or maybe sharing the episode with a friend. Anything you can do to help promote and support Creative Noahland is so beneficial, and I really appreciate it. Check out the website and sign up to the newsletter to be the first to know of everything that's going on here in Creative Noahland. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, explore, inspire, and create.
Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way. And so, therefore, it's so important to consider this question: what do I desire?